When I was 7, my mom hired a babysitter during the summer because she and my dad both worked full-time jobs. They loved work and neither of them wanted to take part-time hours. So they hired Leah, and I absolutely loved her. She was like the big sister I never had. I told her all my secrets and crushes on the boys at school. My brother, who was 9, liked her as well. The 3 of us spent summer days under the ridiculously hot Canadian sun and ate popsicles by the box. One time, Leah took us for a ride on our bikes around the neighborhood, down the old dirt path, to the gate that led to the horse farm, turned dog daycare, and back to the house. The ride only took about 10 minutes and was enough to settle us down, being hyperactive, almost not quite preteens. She locked the front door, but left the back sliding door unlocked because the thick wooden fence was 6 feet high and there was no gate to get into the backyard. It didn't matter. When I was little, the area we lived in was newly developed and had non-existent crime rates. So we biked back and put our bikes in the front yard, walked up the porch into the house. Leah looked really nervous, and when I asked her what was wrong, she just smiled and said nothing. Austin and I started raiding the pantry in search of delicious, all-holy Dunkaroos or, God forbid, fruit fun roll-ups, sweet heavenly Jesus. Leah was back to being doe-eyed and cheery and knelt down in front of me. She was around 14, I think.
We're going to play a little game, okay?
She told me. I was just so excited I probably was this close to peeing myself. Leah handed each of us a paring knife. Not a huge one, just enough to fit in our hands. She told us they were our explorer swords. She made us promise not to run or stab each other. She got the bigger knife, and the 3 of us explored the house. In my mom's room, some of her clothes were on the floor. Thinking back on it, that should have been a red flag, because my parents are both absolute neat freaks. She once had a breakdown because my aunts decolor-coded her bookshelf. Anyway, we kept moving through the house, opening closets and looking under beds. We made it to the garage, which was the only kind of messy room in the house, besides Austin's. Leah walked further into the garage before she suddenly stopped.
Nothing's in here, guys. I told you, it was just the wind that opened the door.
She said. Before my big mouth could correct her, she grabbed me and pretty much dragged us upstairs while saying something like,
Let's go, or we'll be late for swimming, okay?
We all walked out of the house and across the street to my father's military friend's house. Leah set me and Austin in front of the PlayStation and walked into another room with my dad's friend. We stayed there playing games until my parents came home, and for some reason, Leah wouldn't let me or Austin leave the rec room, far away from the windows, constantly under the watchful eye of military guy's wife. Then my parents picked us up and we went home and everything was fine. I forgot about it until last year. When I was 14, I asked Leah, we stayed friends as she is my mother's friend's daughter, what had happened with all that. She told me what really happened. The back door was open when we got back, and it wasn't the wind, because it was a sliding porch door. While we were playing Explorer in the garage, She had gone towards the family's rowboat and saw a guy crouching under it, holding a weirdly shaped knife. He wasn't facing her, so she played dumb and got us the fuck out of there. Then she told the military guy what had happened, and he went over to our house with one of his guns and went into the garage to check it out. He found the guy in the midst of his escape, and there was a tussle before this crazy dude got out and scaled the fence into the bushes and got away. His backpack had hit the fence though and split on a nail. He dropped several things, including a weird sort of nightstick with a small rabbit-sized belt tied around it. A few weird Polaroid photos of blurry rooms and a porn mag. Not a regular porn mag though. There was pictures of naked in there. Children my age or younger. They called the police, but never found the guy. Anyway, creepy, pedophilic, child-stalking house enterer. I hope your stupid ass tripped on a tree branch and you hit your head and died. Let's not meet again. This took place during the late summer of 1993. I was living in Montana, but had a boyfriend in British Columbia, and I often traveled between the two places. We were broke and careless, so we hitchhiked when we needed to get somewhere further than biking distance. I had spent the month of August with him in BC, and eventually it was time to go back to school. I, of course, not having worked much all summer, had no money. My bum boyfriend hadn't come through with any money for a bus ticket either. My parents were mad at me, so they weren't giving me any money. All my friends were broke, but we didn't have a phone to call them anyway. We were living in a 2-room cabin with no running water in the mountains. The only phone was a party line that belonged to the neighbors and was basically only for emergencies. The decision was made. I was already 2 days late for school, and I didn't feel like panhandling for a bus ticket. I had to get back and couldn't wait for the boyfriend's money to materialize. It would be my first time hitchhiking alone. I put my backpack's worth of stuff together, making sure I had my ID, because one time we hitched to the border, left Canada, and tried to get into the US before I realized I had left my ID in Canada, meaning I had no ID to enter the US, but also no ID to get back into Canada. But that's a story for another day. And hit the road. Things went surprisingly smoothly for the majority of the trip. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got off the mountain and into town, and took me all the way to Creston, right near the border crossing. I walked across and was picked up almost immediately by a guy who at first gave me the mild creeps. But all he did was lecture me about how dangerous it was to hitchhike alone and how much I reminded him of his daughter. He took me all the way to Coeur d'Alene, ID, which was damn near half the trip. I was actually having phenomenal luck. I walked to just outside the city limits and stuck my thumb out. 1 hour went by, then 2. You're often walking really slowly when you're trying to catch a ride, and eventually I came across a small flap of cardboard. I picked it up, thinking I could walk off at the next exit, borrow a marker at the gas station, and make a sign. I thought that might help me get a ride. So I'm walking along a little faster now, and suddenly I see something moving in my peripheral vision. I tense, look, and see that it's a 2-foot, thin, dark snake trying to get over the cement guardrail to the shoulder. He was never gonna make it. He was kind of trying to throw himself over it sideways. I happen to kinda like snakes, and he looked pretty harmless, so I used my sign as a shovel and pitched him over the wall. In hindsight, I should have realized the snake was a bad omen. Before I could reach the next exit, a car slowed to a stop. It's always creepy when a car stops and you're walking up to it, trying to judge if it's Ted Bundy or just an eccentric like you. My heart always sank a little when it would be a single man, but I soon realized he wasn't alone. There was a kid in the front seat who looked to be around 10 to 13. The guy was a little too friendly, but what was he going to do? Murder me in front of the kid? I was young and very dumb. I decided to get in. The man was pretty chatty, introducing the kid as his nephew. He said they were driving back to where they lived in St. Louis from visiting his brother in Seattle, so the kid could visit his grandma. The kid hardly said a word. If I remember, and it's been a very long time, it's about 3 hours to where I lived from 𝙈𝙚𝙩𝙨. He was taking Highway 90 right past the city I lived in. So I was relieved I wouldn't have to get out of the car and thumb it again. The first hour goes by, and it's friendly chit-chat, lots of family anecdotes and general small talk. The switchblade my boyfriend gave me was cradled in the bottom of my palm the whole time, up my sleeve and out of view, but I began to relax a little. He kept up the friendly chatter, but eventually the questions he was asking took a raunchier turn, like did I have a boyfriend, what did we like to do, what was our favorite position. What? I slightly panicked, like, oh, fuck, this guy is a creep after all. My instinct was to play along with his conversation while I tried to figure out what to do. I was pretty sure the drink he had in the console in a convenience store cup had more than pop in it, because you could see him physically getting looser as the drive went on. He kept asking gross questions, and I was so embarrassed for his nephew, but still playing along. I just tried to breathe deeply to keep from having an anxiety attack and concentrated on extricating myself from his car. Eventually, he made it clear that he expected me to have sex with him in exchange for the ride.
Door-to-door service.
He said. Then it got worse.
And find one of your girlfriends for my nephew.
He said, with his hyper-cheerful, also menacing smile that made my stomach drop. Yeah, I had to get away from this guy, ASAP. At this point, we were about 20 minutes from the town I lived in. I was like, sure, and started making stuff up about a phantom, hot, slutty friend I had. Then it finally hit me, what I could do to get away. I put on my best come-hither smile and said to him,
You know what? I bet she's home now. Let's go straight over to her place when we get to town and get this date started.
So I had him get off at my exit and asked if we could get some beer first for our date. In Montana, you could buy beer at the gas stations, so I had him stop at a place a few blocks from where I lived. When he somewhat reluctantly went inside to buy beer, which I knew was in the back of the store, I opened my door and sprinted down the alley about a block and dove into a huge clump of bushes, folded myself up as tight as I could, and waited. I still had my knife, but now it was out of my sleeve. I was shaking and my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would explode. I tucked my head into my knees and waited, listening for his car to come down the alley. When we had got to the gas station, it was about 4 p.m. in September, so there was still plenty of light. I stayed in those damn bushes until night fell, and then I finally sprinted home. His car never came down the alley, but I could hear him yelling for me. He sounded pissed. I got in my front door, locked the deadbolt and collapsed. Dirt and little leaves all over me. My roommate was like,
What the happened to you?
I told her the abbreviated version, and she said,
Why didn't you call me? I would have picked you up at the border.
Background: I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the side and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor Mike take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are shooting the shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happens next still troubles me to this day and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery peddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth.
Are all your children safe in bed?
she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents, not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly, shitting myself. I responded by telling her that they were fine and she had to leave.
That's good. Just as expected for this time.
She said, with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where the shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of,
Hey, Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out.
I instantly called her and let her know I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent's door to take a pic and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. So, for a preface, I was 19, I'm now 22, and I worked in the mall in my town. My town is relatively calm, never any major crimes committed, but the city that's about 15 minutes out used to have the highest murder rate in Canada. The mall I worked in was pretty small. The usual type of customers were mums with their kids or older people just trying to pass the time. Not a sketchy type of mall at all. A very safe place to work at. One day I was on my break and I went to the food court to get a drink and sit down and just browse my phone as usual. I noticed two women walking towards me, and my instinct was they saw my uniform and they were going to ask me something about a product my store sold. I thought nothing sinister of it. They come up to me and sit down right away. They both had heavy accents, though I'm not sure what kind, because it hadn't been something I had ever heard. They were dressed very classy, as if they were going to church, and they relatively seemed completely normal. One of the women pulls out a book and begins asking me some odd questions, such as,
You go to church? Do you believe in God?
mainly just stuff that has to do with religion. So I assumed they were some sort of missionaries. Then they began to tell me about God the Mother. With me being extremely shy, I just listened to them talk. They then asked me if I was able to come with them to a youth group they had organized that was going on tonight. I told them that I was at work and just on a break, so I couldn't go, but they continued to insist. Finally, they got the message that I couldn't go with them, so they asked me for my phone number and told me that they'd text me next time they arrange one and I could go. I really didn't want to talk to them anymore. I wanted to get them to leave, so I agreed and gave them my phone number. A couple of days later, I got a text from them trying to arrange something. but I just blocked the number and thought nothing of it. It's not that I thought they were planning to hurt me. I just wasn't really into going to a youth group. Then a couple of months later, I was reading the news, and there was a story warning young girls about a human trafficking scheme in my city. It said that women would come up to you and talk to you about God the Mother and try to get you to leave with them. So, thank goodness I hadn't finished my shift yet, and thank goodness that I never responded to that text. It's so weird to me to think that if I would have went, I probably wouldn't even be in Canada right now.